On October 17, 1941, Philip Peters was found bludgeoned to death in his home in Denver, Colorado. When the authorities arrived on the scene, they found all of the doors and windows locked and no sign of forced entry. With no clues, the case went cold for 9 months before the truth was revealed about how the killer had gotten into the house. This is Monsters. Theodore Edward Coneys was born on November 10, 1882 in Petersburg, Illinois, to parents Thomas Coneys and Isabella Elam. In 1888, when Theodore was around 6 years old, his father died, and that prompted Isabella to move with Theodore to a farm in Wisconsin and then one in Colorado, where she found work as a housekeeper. Isabella died in 1911. Since his childhood, Theodore always struggled with his health. In fact, doctors had even told him it was unlikely that he would live to 18 years old. That belief meant Theodore didn't finish high school, but he was able to secure work in early adulthood. Theodore eventually began working as a bookkeeper for Denver Brass Works for a while, but he soon found himself in a cycle of repeated unemployment, likely exacerbated by the Great Depression he was living through. Theodore felt like an outcast, someone forgotten by society. He would spend his nights sleeping down alleyways and his days trying to get enough pennies together for something to fill his stomach. For the next 30 years of Theodore's life, he drifted between New York and California before returning to Denver, Colorado in 1941. Once again finding himself homeless, 59-year-old Theodore decided to visit a friend of sorts, a man named Philip Peters, who he had known many years prior. They had met in 1899 when Philip had just started his career at the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The pair met at the Denver Guitar Club where Philip gave lessons. Philip showed true kindness to Theodore at the time, who was soon eating frequent meals with him and his new wife Helen. Theodore opened up to them about his health struggles, his lack of high school education, and his childhood. A few years would pass before they saw each other again as Philip was leaving the train station. He bumped into a young man and soon realized it was the teenager he had shared those dinners with years before. Theodore told Philip that his mother, Isabella, had lost her house after selling it to invest in a mining operation. The men who convinced her to do that just took the money and vanished. The next time the men met was in 1912, the year after Theodore's mother had passed. He told Philip of the sad news, expressing he was unsure of what his life had in store going forward. What Theodore didn't mention to Philip, who by now had a successful career, children, and his own home, was that he had been living under a bridge in California for months prior. The men would only see each other again almost 30 years later, but by then, while Philip knew who the man was, he could not recognize Theodore, who was the last person he ever laid eyes on. It was sometime in September of 1941 when 59-year-old Theodore Coneys found himself in Philip Peters' neighborhood. That was how he described the following event, saying, quote, "I was in the neighborhood in September 1941 and found the house unlocked and no one home. I went in and stole some food. I was in bad shape, my lungs were giving me a lot of trouble, and I was at the end of my rope. Fall was coming on and I couldn't face another winter on the road. I had to have a place to stay. I didn't know Mrs. Peters was in the hospital. I found the hole in the closet, climbed through, and slept and slept." Theodore was now living in Philip's attic, but it was no expansive A-frame room he could call home. It was cramped and dingy, more of a closet than anything, but to Theodore it was better than sleeping on the street. He went on to admit that as Theodore got more confident in his ability to hide and avoid the now 73-year-old Philip, he began following him from room to room, just far enough back that Philip didn't realize. He said, quote, "It was sort of a game, it gave me a thrill. But that game came to a tragic end when Theodore mistimed one of his visits down to the kitchen when he believed Philip had already left to visit Helen in the hospital. Theodore was raiding the refrigerator when Philip walked into his own kitchen and found this random man inside his home. He struck Theodore with his cane, but instead of fleeing, Theodore hit Philip over the head with a pistol he had found in the home. After repeated blows, the weapon crumbled, but Theodore continued his attack. He picked up an iron stove shaker and beat Philip to death. Then he climbed back up into the attic and waited. It wasn't long before Philip was found. Neighbors who knew Helen was in the hospital had been inviting Philip over for dinner each night, and when he failed to show up as expected that evening, they went to check on him. Upon finding Philip bleeding on the kitchen floor, they promptly called the police. It was clear from the start that it was no accident. The iron stove shaker used to kill Philip lay near his body, covered in blood, so the investigators had to ask themselves who would want to harm Philip Peters. It was a question they would not easily answer. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and while they saw the trap door, none of the officers even considered an adult person could fit through it. Helen returned home once she had recovered in the hospital but required additional help around the home, so she hired a housekeeper. After a few months, the housekeeper couldn't handle the spooky home anymore, and Helen was forced to hire a second housekeeper, but the same thing happened. By then, Helen herself had also begun to hear strange things from the home, like footsteps and sounds coming from the walls. Helen ended up moving in with her son, who lived in western Colorado, after a neighbor who had been caring for her on occasion witnessed a ghost at the foot of the stairs. In reality, it was Theodore. After hearing of the incident and thinking of Philip's murder, detectives from the Denver Police Department decided to wait across the street from the empty home and watch to see if anyone came or went. Eventually, in the window for a fleeting moment, they saw a ghoulish face that disappeared a moment later. That gave them enough cause to search the house. The furniture inside was covered in white sheeting, and the home seemed deserted. As they continued their search along the bottom floor, the men noticed a pungent smell. Reinforcements were on the way as they made their way upstairs, just in time to see the swing of a closet door across the room. Once they peered inside, the detectives found a pair of legs trying to squeeze up into the attic. One detective grabbed a leg and gave a mighty pull, which led to the man trying to climb into the attic passing out on the bedroom floor. The investigators immediately called for an ambulance. The man, who they would soon find out was named Theodore Coneys, was emaciated and looked as though he hadn't eaten a square meal in months. When he regained consciousness, Theodore was taken in for questioning, where he came clean about everything. When Theodore's story broke in the news, he became known as the Denver Spiderman of Moncrief Place, a name coming from police detective Fred Zarno's statement that said, quote, "A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there." Theodore Coneys was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Philip Peters and sent to Cannon City Penitentiary. In an odd way, life in prison was the best Theodore had ever had. He was no longer emaciated and no longer had to struggle to survive. Theodore became the prison librarian and spent his remaining years buried in books before he died on May 16, 1967, having served 25 years of his sentence. This story is not the first account of someone unknowingly living inside someone else's house, and it certainly isn't the last. So the next time you hear a bump in the night, maybe you shouldn't just shrug it off and go back to sleep. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.